Good morning, everybody. Greetings and welcome. My name is Tom Banchoff. I serve as Vice President for Global Engagement here at Georgetown and also as Director of our Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. And on behalf of our entire university community, I'm really delighted to welcome you to this very important conference on the Russian war against Ukraine, the transformation of Ukrainian society, and prospects and strategies for reconstruction, now, amidst the conflict, and once the fighting stops. It's really great to be here with all of you. Archbishop Gudjak, we're especially honored to have you here with us again at Georgetown. We're meeting, of course, at a sobering time. Russia's war of aggression is just over 1 year old and continues unabated, taking the lives of tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians, with the numbers of the dead, the injured, and the suffering growing by the day. The anniversary of Putin's unprovoked assault is an occasion to remember the innocent victims of this criminal war. But I think you'll agree it's also cause for some solace as we see the resilience of the Ukrainian people, the resilience of the Ukrainian military, fighting so bravely and effectively for their sovereignty and territorial integrity. As we witness the solidarity of so many governments and citizens around the world willing to lend a material hand. Not enough and not fast enough, to be sure, but assistance and support that has proved so critical and impactful and that will continue. Georgetown, our whole university community, is part of this worldwide network and alliance of solidarity. Just outside these doors, within days of the Russian attack, our Ukrainian students led a rally against the war. Just last week, on the 1 year anniversary of the onset of the war, we had another gathering of students to mark that sad occasion, but again, to look forward in hope and solidarity. Our solidarity as a university community has not flagged and will not flag into the future. And it goes beyond statements and gestures, however important those are. We're working hard across Georgetown to have a positive impact in other ways as well, in the present, but also into the future, as we think through and work towards a free and independent Ukraine at the heart of Europe. That's the hopeful horizon that brings us together for today's conference. I could give you a long list of what we're doing. I'll just give you 3 quick examples. First, through the generosity of a $5 million grant from the Gracias Family Foundation, our School of Foreign Service is able to offer scholarships and support the academic and personal financial needs of Georgetown students affected by the war in Ukraine. A second example, you may have read about this, the Georgetown Law Center on National Security has received a $10 million grant from the Department of State to advance international efforts to support the Ukrainian government in its investigation and prosecution of war crimes committed during the Russian invasion. And a third example, the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, under the leadership of our colleague Milan Verveer, has been deeply engaged in efforts to support Ukrainian civil society in a multitude of ways. For example, through a very powerful Hillary Rodham Clinton Award ceremony this past December, honoring First Lady Olena Zelenska and other prominent Ukrainian women leaders. So these are just 3 examples. I could give you more. These are modest contributions, but we're trying to think together with you on an occasion like this about how we can be part of this overall effort going forward. And when Milan and I were thinking about this conference with our colleague Jose Casanova, a Ukraine expert in his own right, a senior fellow in the Berkeley Center, was Jose's idea for this conference. As we were thinking through how we might spend the day, we agreed that a focus both on the present and the future made sense. And our hope is that Georgetown, with our academic strengths, our Washington, D.C. location, our Catholic and Jesuit commitment to the common good, can be well positioned, has been and will continue to be well positioned as a convening space for scholars and practitioners committed to understanding and supporting a path forward for Ukraine in collaboration with the international community. In that spirit, over the course of the day, we'll look forward to engaging all of you in 3 related conversations. In a few moments, I'll invite Jose up to the stage for our first panel, with panelists who will be discussing the war and the transformation of Ukrainian society, a look at the challenges and opportunities for institution building and Ukraine's democratic consolidation, including leadership roles for women. After lunch in this room, which will be an opportunity for informal conversation, we'll have our second panel chaired by my colleague Catherine Marshall, also of the Berkeley Center, on religion, civil society, and paths to reconciliation. And there we'll continue the focus on the societal level with a look at religious and other divisions and possibilities for reconciliation and cooperation going forward. Our final panel this afternoon on post-war reconstruction will incorporate the international dimension of the tasks ahead and explore the positive role that governments, international agencies, but also universities like ours and other international cultural institutions around the globe can play going forward. So the focus, as I said, will be on conversation. There'll be no papers. You see no screen for PowerPoints up here. We really hope to foster open dialogue up here, but also with all of you. This is such a complex set of issues, moving issues, military, diplomatic, political, religious, social, and cultural, that we really value the opportunity to think them through openly with you during this forum. Before we get started, just to acknowledge the sponsors for today's event: the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, the Walsh School of Foreign Service, SFS, and within SFS, the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies. This is truly a university-wide effort. I especially want to thank the Berkeley Center team on the execution side, and Imogene Johnson in particular. So once again, thank you for joining us for what promises to be a great conversation. Now please join me in welcoming Jose Casanova and our first panel to the stage.
Thank you, Tam, for these welcoming words. I'm delighted to be able to moderate this panel with 3 outstanding figures that know Ukraine very well and then can help us in the conversation. I'm going to introduce them briefly and then we'll start. To my left here, Serhii Plokhy is the Mikhailo Hrushevsky Professor of Ukrainian History and the director of the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University, the author of many, many books, actually historical bestsellers, books of history, and again, one leading historian of Ukraine and also the relation with Russia. Frank Session is the Peter Jasik director of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies for Ukrainian Research, also a history professor of history in the History and Classics department at the University of Alberta. Previously served as associate director of the Harvard Research Institute. And last but not least, Ambassador Melan Bervier, as you've heard, she's the director of our institute here on Women, Peace and Security. She served as U.S. Ambassador at Large for Women Issues. And in this capacity, she served to make sure that women issues were at the center of the United States diplomacy and visited over 60 countries to advance the economic, political, and social advancement of women. Prior to that, she also served as assistant to President Clinton and Chief of Staff of First Lady Hillary Clinton. Throughout these years, she has visited many, many times Ukraine, and she is as qualified as anybody to discuss the issues, especially of women issues in Ukraine. With this, I'm going to ask each of you to begin with introductory kind of presentation. Words would you like to touch, and then we'll have a conversation. So, Serhii.
Thank you for this introduction. Thank you for invitation to this conference and to this panel. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. The topic is society and transformation in the society, Ukrainian society in particular, and I wanted to start with some numbers and figures. And in Ukraine, we have today more. Every third citizen of Ukraine actually being displaced one way or another. So the max number of people who left the country is close to 8 million. Since May, there are more people crossing the border from Europe back to Ukraine than from Ukraine going to Europe. Within country itself, there are different estimates, but anywhere between 5 and 6 million people displaced. Up to 1 million people are in the armed forces and in different formations. So it's a change, tragic, dramatic, but it is of enormous proportions. The country is at war, and even those who are not displaced or who came back or who are not in the armed forces, they're under the threat of attack, and the air sirens go off and on again and again in almost every city, every major city in Ukraine. So that is just the background for any discussion about society and Ukrainian society at war. Economically, there is a major impact of the war as well on Ukraine and how Ukraine functions. The economic loss in the gross domestic product is at least 30%, maybe more. The expectations, or basically the prognoses of GDP were that it would go down further. It looks like as of December of the last year, it was 30%. The projections were up to 50%. Still, it's enormous loss. 50% of the entire budget goes to the defense, which is close to 20% of GDP. That is, again, that's another very important factor on the top of being displaced. Also, what is happening with economy. And every second hryvnia, every second dollar today in Ukraine comes from the assistance from outside of the country. Despite all of that, you see a very different picture that emerges from the polling data on Ukraine and Ukrainian attitudes. At the worst moments in the war, in March, there were anywhere between 75 to 80% of people who were declaring that they believed in victory. The data coming from the last month and a half, it's 95%. People who believe in ultimate victory. The institutions that have most trust of Ukrainians are the armed forces. 92% approximately of Ukrainians actually have trust in the armed forces. Volunteer organizations, 85%. And the president then goes next with anywhere between 77% to 84%. Much less trust there is in political parties and politicians as such. So it's below 50%. So there are institutions, armed forces in particular. The church there is with 59-60%. The media is 55%. So, but there is less trust in politicians than there is trust in media, which is quite unique. You have a major change in attitudes toward Russia. If before the start of the war, at the end of 2021, 75% of Ukrainians had overall positive attitude toward Russians, today 82% of Ukrainians said that they had a negative attitude toward Russia and Russians in general. So 97% of Ukrainians have, of course, very, very negative view and attitude toward Vladimir Putin. That translates into a number of changes that happen in the Ukrainian society, in Ukraine as a whole, and those changes are being reported on by including Western media. The removal, for example, of the statues and monuments to the Russian cultural figures, literary figures like Pushkin and Tolstoy and others who are perceived as basically markers or symbols of continuing imperial presence in Ukraine. There is a transformation of attitude toward language. And in Kyiv in particular, there is a major shift with 33% of the population, citizens of Kyiv, reporting that they switched from Russian to Ukrainian in the course of the last year. The city remains, according to that data, is being very much bilingual still. So 47% communicate in Ukrainian with friends, 44% in family and friends, between 44 and 47%. And that number increases when basically people are asked about the language that they use at work. Goes to 60%, and in the educational institutions over 80%. But there is a big change that you look at the TV, you look at those statues being removed, but this is a sign of major transformations happening in spheres of culture, of identity. And even in the realm of language practices, which are the most conservative, which don't change overnight, but this self-reporting number of 33% is quite amazing for Kyiv. There is a lot of discussion in Washington and beyond today about the future and the end of the war and how the end of the war would look like. And what are the imagined or real red lines in the mind of Vladimir Putin, and whether it's too risky to give too many weapons to the Ukrainians that they would try to return Crimea or go back to the borders of 1991. One of the lessons that certainly that last year taught us in terms of the thinking in the United States on many levels, from the government to the academic level and so on and so forth, that there is constantly one and the same thing that is happening. This is underestimating the Ukrainians and underestimating the Ukrainian resolve. So it started always the idea that Kyiv would fall in 3 days. Ukraine would not last for more than 2 weeks, and we are now marking a year of a horrible war, but the war in which Ukraine still fights and even wins. And the cause of that first of all, mistakes on our side, and also the way how the war goes is this really amazing, unprecedented Ukrainian resilience. I'll give you some numbers in that regard. So today, in the middle of this destruction of livelihood, of huge losses, of dislocation, 60% of Ukrainians believe that the country is moving in the right direction. 60%. Before the war, it was only 20%. So the number of those who believe that country through the carnage of the war still goes in the right direction tripled since the start of the war, and that's quite amazing. Something that we should study for sure, should discuss, but also we have to take into account when we think about what US and the West as a whole is doing today and thinking about our future. Because it's certainly time to start or to end this process of underestimating Ukrainians and Ukrainian resolve to fight back. Thank you.
Thank you, Serhii. Frank?
So a historian gets invited to talk about the present and future. This is always dangerous. As well gets invited to Washington, where government decisions are also important on what will happen to Ukraine's present and future. But perhaps I can go a little bit back to say that one has to see where it was coming from. And I'd like to discuss just two issues of where I think academia and government and others got many things wrong, or else had perspectives that only change slowly. Now, I admit I also do it in a city where they got things very right. American intelligence told about the invasion and understood the invasion. And of course, this is, I think, crucial in understanding Ukraine's ability and chance to fight off that Russian invasion. So the first of the two that I would discuss is the difference between ethno-cultural nations and groups and what we like to call civic nations, and what I view as a binary trap, that much of academia viewed it as either one way or another, and Ukraine was frequently placed, when it seemed to spring from nowhere in the minds of many in the West in 1991 as a state, that its greatest danger would be if there was deep Ukrainian ethno-national development, and what would happen to the multicultural or particularly multilingual, particularly Russian-Ukrainian binary linguistic situation in Ukraine. And these became the topics that many scholars studied, not least of which because many of them didn't know Ukrainian yet. They were coming from traditional Soviet and Russian studies, knew Russian, had certain contacts that they thought they saw through Moscow and to a degree through Kiev, what was going on in that society. And I think it was always a trap because there are really very few nation states in Europe today where we can say they are entirely creations of a civic national identity or an ethno-cultural tradition that came before them. And Ukraine fits into what I would call the Central European paradigm. In fact, it had been a national cultural movement, and particularly because of the discrimination of Ukrainian as a language, which in the Russian Empire in the 19th century played a very important role in the Ukrainian national movement, that had modern Ukrainians identifying where Ukraine would be. As many of the countries of Europe, Slovakia, where was Slovakia? When does it become an entity? We can go through the entire parts of the Balkans and see these issues. And Ukraine did not differ. It had a great mix of cultures with Polish, Jewish, Russian, and Crimean Tatar and other cultures in the 19th century. A national movement was formed. That national movement then tried to establish an independent Ukrainian state in 1917 to 21. And this is a very important moment for us because we have all seen Putin try and distort history and inform us that it was Lenin who created Ukraine and leave out that Ukrainian national movement of the 19th century. That defined the Ukrainian territory in many ways, and throughout the 20th century, those borders changed. The national movement did not succeed in forming a national state in 17 to 21. But on the other hand, we can say in many ways the Ukrainians' attempt to form a state explained why the Soviet Union existed, at least as a theoretical federation, but as a country in which there would be national republics. And so Ukraine played a crucial role in that. I might add that the first leader of the independent Ukrainian state was the historian Mikhailo Hrushevsky, who had written a multi-volume history of Ukraine. that was banned after the 1930s in Ukraine, all 12 volumes and 8,000 pages. I might add both Serhiy Plokhy and I worked on the English translation, not of as translators, but editors of this in more recent times. And I think one of the most interesting events of Ukrainian independence when it did come was that suddenly Volume 1, which only goes up to the year 1015, was published in 100,000 copies. And people waited on lines through the night to get a chance to buy that history of Ukraine. What it tells us was a society which was much traumatized throughout the 20th century, in which freedom of inquiry was not permitted, and therefore in which relations among groups and cultures could not work out in a free context of interchange, which is so necessary in doing it. It also meant that those who had set down in academia the divides of how they understood Ukraine, it was often seen through the Russian prism that academics and particularly political leaders who were, as we know, in the early 1990s, above all worried about the nuclear issue, something that's emerged again, and how they would get the nuclear arms out of Ukraine, which was really Washington's major interest in Ukraine in the early 1990s. And in many ways, I think then meant that Ukraine was put on a secondary list, a back burner, by most of those capitals, and why it took so long, really, to change the prism that had come from understandings of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union in dealing with Ukraine. What it also meant is that once the idea of this divide between civic nation and ethnocultural nation set in academia, people began and did not, I think, properly study the changes that occurred over the last 30 years, which have made the Ukraine we are seeing today and made that Ukraine so resilient, and explain a lot of the factors that Serhiy Plokhy has just spoken about changes going on. The second of my issues is what I would call the Russian push effect and the understanding of Russia as an entity. This conference is going to concentrate on Ukraine, but lurking behind this always is Russia and what will be happening with Russia and what that relation will be. It is essential for understanding not only the future of Ukraine, but the future now of the whole Eurasian entity and certainly the European parts of it and major parts of what the American policy towards this region will be. In many ways, by not understanding Ukraine, the field of academia didn't understand Russia over the past 30 years. And we've really seen this coming to the fore, how late really many of the tendencies in Russia were observed. Now, one of the presidents of Ukraine, Leonid Kuchma, not usually viewed as a Ukrainian patriot, put out a work called Ukraine is Not Russia. I think it's a work that many academics didn't have to go further than the title. Had they really thought about it, they would have found out much about Russia, not to speak of finding out about Ukraine. I think, above all, what was not understood was that Ukraine, as it forms after 1991, is a state, a rather weak state in many ways, a state with a very complex society, but one which was open to many new tendencies coming in various directions from Washington, from the European community, from the Ukrainian diasporas, from many groups who are influencing a state and society that's forming. And I think those who have said that it was an example of weak state, strong society, at least tell us what had occurred after the series of revolutions in Ukraine, the Granite Revolution, the Orange Revolution, and then finally the Euromaidan. And above all, the fact that Ukraine was able to be a complicated democracy and one in which society occasionally revolted against the outcomes of rigged elections, but one in which one actually had changes of power, new groups coming in, regional groupings who are fighting for their place in that society, What it was doing was forming the component parts of a full civic society within a political entity, and that what we tended to view Ukraine through the prism of much of the truth of corruption and the propaganda of corruption, and underestimated really the great social changes that explain Ukraine today. On the other hand, all too few saw that Russia was still an empire, both an empire in its attitudes towards what it called the near abroad, but also that the Russian Federation, which is no federation, is in fact a unreformed colonial empire, particularly in relation to the Caucasus and the peoples of Siberia. I think we have seen in this war a shocked public who did not know that there were so many Chechens and Buryats and other people who have been sent, as many colonial powers do, off to die for the empire, largely against their will, had no realization that Russia faced such a demographic catastrophe in many ways. Once it adopted the idea that Russian nationness and orthodoxy are essential for defining Russia, it has no way, therefore, of being really a multicultural and certainly federal society, and that Russia had not yet defined itself as a nation, why it could not fit into Europe. As Ukraine was edging towards Europe and sometimes pulling back, it was following a model of many of the states of Europe, and that it was not the West that pushed Russia away, but in many ways the Russian imperial and colonial tradition that did this. Russia has now brought through this war tremendous changes in both Ukraine and Russia. We tend to say that Putin has consolidated Ukrainian society as never before. To a degree, true, but I think that we're forgetting that consolidation that already occurred 8 years ago after the first Russian invasion and intrusion in Ukraine, and really was going on for the past 20 years. Ukraine was changing. But above all, Russia was becoming more and more alien to Ukraine, including to the Russian speakers of Ukraine. What's come out of this is, at least from the Euromaidan, and now fully, Ukraine has made the European choice. It wants to join NATO. It sees itself in a community of nations. It sees itself as, and it's hard to say, a country sees, much of its population sees itself as alienated from Russia. And we have a Russia that, as far as we can tell, and we cannot have the kind of data we would like, who cannot really find a place for itself as not an empire. And now, after what the last year, with what now the vice president has called crimes against humanity, and I think many scholars will be willing to say genocidal policies that Russia has followed, will be very difficult to reintegrate into that general world order. Of course, it's crucial that in some ways in the future Russia be reintegrated. It's to the advantage of Ukraine that it should be so. It's very hard for any Ukrainian to think at the moment of any kind of reconciliation and any positive future for Russia. But I think within time, all realize that that has to be part of the combination. If there can be a strong and democratic and independent Ukraine, that may be the best way for Russia to begin that slow path that's going to be in returning to the international community. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Ambassador?
Well, thank you, and Jose, and to my co-panelists here, wonderful explanations of the transformations that have been taking place. I want to look at the transformation that is taking place with respect to half the population of Ukraine. Truly rooted in the past, very much an issue of present day, which I want to speak to, and I think says a great deal about the future. And that is the role of the women in Ukraine. Certainly they have been, in many ways, disproportionately impacted by this war, but they are by no means silent victims. There is extraordinary leadership being demonstrated at every level of Ukrainian society in terms of dealing with the onslaught that has been meted out every day by Russia in this case. Certainly, women who are mothers, who are struggling with trying to give their children as reasonable a life as is possible under the constraints that they're operating. Tremendous displacement that you heard about, both internal displacement as well as refugees out of the country, trying to knit together some sort of existence. We're hearing more and more about the impacts, and these will be studied far into the future, of what this trauma represents for even future generations of Ukrainians as they begin to take their place one day. And the whole issue of the educational systems and dealing with what's needed, as well as the crises of the moment. But just as they are struggling, they are doing their part, so too are women in the armed forces. Today, almost 25% of the Ukrainian armed forces are comprised of Ukrainian women. They are engaged in multiple ways. There are some 60,000 of them fully engaged and growing numbers. And this has had some history to it, going way back, but most immediately with the Donbass invasion, where women were part of what's been called the Invisible Battalion. They were not formally allowed in combat roles in Ukraine in those years. And that changed by 2017 to the place where it is today. But they were very much engaged at all levels and in combat. And we see today that kind of same spirit now more officially sanctioned. They are part of the official armed forces, but it came out of the role that they played in the Donbass. So this whole area of women's engagement in the security sector, I think, is one we need to be mindful of. Thirdly, they are spearheading humanitarian relief. It is easy to say humanitarian relief. It is very difficult to grasp the multiple ways that needs are being met in Ukraine today. It is a very complex situation. I was moderating a panel yesterday with women in Ukraine who were talking about what's happening on the ground with those women's organizations, with the village leaders. Some 42% officially are women in the construct of the political apparatus. But there's tremendous work going on to bring the kind of necessary measures, whether medical, whether emergency, whether food, whether shelter, what to do with the displacement, with transportation, and it goes on and on. I have one woman who was active for years in the NGO leadership, and her whole mission of the NGO was to create a dynamic voluntary sector in Ukraine, the spirit of civic participation and civic engagement. And she said that all the years she worked on this, she looks out now and she says, we have a voluntary sector. Everybody in Ukraine is trying to do his or her part in bringing this war to victory. So just spearheading the humanitarian engagement is an enormous undertaking, and that contribution it's making to maintaining some sort of social cohesion in the midst of tremendous dislocation. Fourthly, they're documenting these war crimes, crimes against humanity. One of the growing understandings of what's happening to women in Ukraine, not just women, but mostly to women, is the pervasive rape that is taking place on a scale that does border the understanding of what a crime against humanity is. This takes tremendous documentation. It takes interviewing those who've been victimized by these crimes. It takes a concerted effort to ensure that there's going to be that evidence to ultimately bring the leader and the soldiers who engaged in this to accountability and to justice. It is a tremendously difficult process. And there was reference earlier to what it's going to take in terms of international and domestic justice apparatus that really needs to begin now. It is beginning with this documentation, but also in terms of the international community, in terms of the International Criminal Court, the potential of a special tribunal that many see as absolutely critical to deal with the crime of aggression. All of this needs to be happening now. Much of it is happening, but there's much more that needs to be done. They're also working about in terms of the economic realities that you heard about. A very difficult situation, businesses having to move, businesses too having to function in a place different from where they were. There are some data about the numbers of small businesses that are meeting a critical need in terms of what the women are able to do. So the contributions to maintaining an economy that is under tremendous duress that you've already heard about. There are more and more women, clearly not enough, but the changes have come in the last decade in the parliament. And what they're doing as the Rada meets on several of these many issues confronting the country is a demonstration of their bringing a lens and with their participation to the kind of critical issues that need to be engaged on. And one of the most interesting aspects that I think is illustrative of this kind of leadership is what's being referred to more and more as the diplomatic battalion. You know, in years past, and I've been in Washington ever since I was a student at Georgetown, I never really left. The reality is that it was always the male parliamentarians, the male leaders of Ukraine, who would come on one issue or another, and there was a constant stream of issues relating to policy, foreign policy in Ukraine. What we're seeing today, obviously, is the men are tremendously engaged in the security aspects of the war. And who are coming? This new diplomatic battalion of women leaders, parliamentarians, NGO leaders. I've had people at the State Department tell me, we've never seen advocacy like this coming out of Ukraine. Very much understanding of even what's in American policy in terms of what needs to be done and what we're doing or not doing. But really extraordinary advocacy, not just to Washington, but across capitals around the world. So this is another critical role that they are playing and engaged in. And what they will all tell you is we never thought we would be advocating for weapons. That was never in their framework of operations. But as they also say, without the weapons that are needed to win this war, nothing else will be able to happen that they also deeply care about. And I just want to say that, you know, a lot of this change, this transformative change in terms of women's leadership in what has been a very much a patriarchal society, has come out of the last 10 years, and I think in a very pivotal way, out of the revolution of dignity, the Euromaidan. More than half of the participants were women. They were functioning at every level of need in terms of those protests. They were forming operations on the ground, SOS Maidan, the People's Hospital, all kinds of humanitarian needs needed to be addressed. And in fact, Alexandra Matvichuk, who got to the Maidan, started something called SOS Maidan because she felt that the dignity of the Ukrainian people needed to be maintained, as they were also protesting against the corruption, protesting in favor of a more Western alliance for Ukraine, for democracy. She then went to create an NGO, and the Euromaidans, women's participation spawned all kinds of NGOs. Hers is focused on the dignity of Ukrainians and their human rights. And she was recently awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And she was here at Georgetown several weeks ago talking about how critical addressing this issue today of the crimes against humanity is, and the kind of documentation that needs to take place. So the Euromaidan played a very pivotal role in terms of developing in a stronger way than we'd seen historically women's leadership and participation. It also led to more women being elected over the last 10 years or so, more recently than the earlier part of the decade. And the Equal Opportunity Caucus in the Rada has played an important role. It is across parties. It is not confined in one party. And it has also led to the passage of legislation and new laws having to do with domestic violence, with shelters, with addressing human trafficking, with reforming the local police to address these kinds of issues. So we saw in that period that has so influenced where we are today, a tremendous amount of women's engagement. And then too, after the Maidan, Putin's response was, of course, to gobble up Crimea and then to start the war in the Donbass. And as I said earlier, the women were very engaged in that first part of the war that we now see on the full-scale invasion, but both in terms of the security sector, also in terms of humanitarian. I was at the contact line several times, and it was extraordinary to see the kind of work that was going on, particularly with the elderly, with the disabled, with those who couldn't move out of those desperate situations. So we have in the last period, and certainly manifested today, I think a transformational impact that the women are leading in Ukraine. And I would say that if there's going to be peace, if there's going to be recovery, if there's going to be a viable economy, if there's going to be a bright future, with all of the aspirations that Ukraine has always had, it is not going to happen if the women are marginalized, if they are not a part of all of these processes to bring their talents, their commitment, and their leadership to bear.
Well, thank you so much. We've had a very good start. Let's continue the conversation now about the resilience of civil society, where does it come from, and about presidential elections, because they're actually related. You mentioned Kuchma as president. Kuchma, of course, was elected the same year as Lukashenko in Belarus. He tried to do what Lukashenko and Putin did, to extend his presidency beyond the constitution, tried to change the constitution to be re-elected for a third time, and this is what led to the first mobilization, the rise of civil society against Kuchma. When Kuchma tried to continue his power through bringing Yanukovych as his successor, then we have, of course, the Orange Revolution. And again, when Yanukovych tried to go against what the Ukrainian society wanted, what they had agreed in coming closer to Europe, then you have Euromaidan. So again, And then, of course, you have after Euromaidan the surprising election of Zelensky with over 70% of the population. The first time it was elected not by the East against the West, but it was elected throughout Ukraine with majorities, or at least pluralities, in every oblast of Ukraine, with the exception of Lviv city. And so from Khrushchevsky as the president of Soviet Ukraine to Zelensky, the whole issue of precisely civil society, and yet the way in which civil society has also been organized to protect the democratic system in Ukraine. So I want you to just comment on anything related to those interrelations between civil society and the defense of institutional democracy, because we see fundamentally at the time of Kuchma, Ukraine, Belarus, Russia were very similar post-Soviet societies. Today, as we've heard, Ukraine is radically different from Belarus and from Russia, and it has to do with this relation between civil society and presidential elections. So, please.
Sure. Well, returning to the title of the Kuchma's book, Ukraine is not Russia. But the title comes from actual experiences of Kuchma as the part of the post-Soviet elite. Using the playbook that came from Russia, he was very much trying to repeat exactly the same sort of things that Boris Yeltsin was doing in Russia in the 1990s, rewriting the constitution, creating a strong super-presidential republic, and learning the hard way that Ukraine was not Russia. And that's apparently also one of the phrases that he told Putin when Putin was in 2004, pushing him to use the violence against people who were protesting on Maidan. And what you get there is you get really the strength of the civil society, and it becomes stronger and stronger. And the question is, where does it come from? Why it is not there in Russia, where everyone here in Washington and everywhere in the world in the late 80s and 90s believed really in the end of history, and the end of history was happening in Russia, the victory of liberal democracy. Russia was in the late 80s and early 90s to a degree leading in sort of reforms, of that sort of reforms. And one of the explanations is that it comes from Ukraine's history, very fragmented on the one hand, very dramatic on the other, but it comes from different cultural and political traditions associated with parts of Ukraine that belong to the Russian Empire, to Austria-Hungary, to the Ottoman Empire, and emergence of political culture in which dialogue and compromise became the norm. And that actually also was foundation for the inability of no party in the parliament to create a majority. They had to find a compromise that also empowered the civic society and, say, as you were telling, it stopped an attempts of turning Ukraine into Russia on more than one occasion, because the model for the leadership, the model for the government was very much Yeltsin's and then Putin's model. Now, that certainly changes, and you mentioned Zelensky's election, 73%, a landslide. It's not the first time that the map of political map of Ukraine changed. It changed in 2014 with the election of Poroshenko. So Poroshenko lost a little bit in the east, Zelensky lost a little bit in the west, but the majority of the country voted for those two candidates, which was a game changer compared to what we saw before 2014. That was very much a sort of American outcome of the elections, with 50-50 going one way or another, but with also much more pronounced geographical patterns, in a sense that country was divided into two. It ended in 2014, and then the big question was whether that's something that was produced by the shock of the war, and that Ukraine would go back to this very, very divisive map of political map. And Zelensky showed that it was, or Zelensky's elections rather showed that was a continuation of something that started in 2014, but that this is a trend now. This is a trend. Ukraine is more united since 2014 than it was before, which raises a set of new questions. If the foundations for the strength of Ukrainian democracy were in this different historical patterns and roots and traditions and really fragmentation of the political scene, what does it mean when now the president controls the parliament through the monobilshist, as they say in Ukraine? So the one party controls the entire parliament. It didn't happen in Ukraine before 2019. So what does it do to the Ukrainian democracy? What does it do to the Ukrainian civil society? And the figures that I was given to you in terms of the polling data from Ukraine says that there is change between 2021 and 2022 on a number of issues, but there is no change in the Ukrainian society when the question is asked about what is the fate of democracy. The same number of people believe that democracy is strong in Ukraine in 2021 and 2022. So the war actually didn't change even by 1% the attitude there, which is of course very encouraging. And it's a civil society in which very active are groups that traditionally were marginalized in Ukrainian history. Women is one of those groups. Another is youth. What happened in 2019, it was really a generational revolution. You now meet people coming from Ukraine, members of the parliament, and so on and so forth. This is the generation of the revolution of dignity. They're in their 30s. And that's apart from the, of course, gender transformation. That changes the face of Ukraine, that changes the face of the civic society. So questions are being asked what the war does to the Ukrainian democracy. You have a president who has full control over the parliament. These are very good and legitimate questions, but there are also a lot of signs saying that, okay, Ukrainian democracy is alive and doing well, and will certainly survive this war and hopefully will become strong.
I pick up on some of those themes. One is, while women have been marginalized, it's very interesting historically to look at, even under the Russian Empire, under the Habsburgs, the early roots of the women's equality movement was very much also part of the independence movement, the creation of a Ukrainian state, so to speak. And all of the work that was going on, there was a lot of civic activism. We wouldn't use the same terminologies today for that period all of those years ago, but involved in self-help programs, in community outreach, bringing transformation at the grassroots level was very much a part of that very early history, and always tied in, women's equality tied into the independence of the future Ukrainian state. Also, a strong commitment to language and to the culture. So you see these threads being weaved in many ways into the tapestry that we are dealing with today. I also think it was said earlier that Ukrainian civil society has always been underestimated, and it's been one of my own frustrations, because during the Orange Revolution and what it was to address in terms of the corrupt governance, et cetera, you would have thought that there would be an understanding, a greater understanding, besides the sense, and I feel we're replicating it, the sense of, oh my God, look what Ukraine has done, this Orange Revolution and what it manifested and the strength of the people. And then the Maidan happens all those years later, and you have a replication of that. Again, underestimated, again, filled with just awe in many ways. Ukraine cared more about being united with Europe than Europe was caring about its own identity, it seemed. And then you've got the realities of today. Again, extraordinary awe and just a sense of where does this resilience come from? And look what they're manifesting again. Now, how that translates in the end and what it means, but you have this recurrence, I think. So whether in early times or present times or more recent times, you do see this sense of civic participation in ways of carrying out the kind of Ukrainian state, once it's come to fruition with the independence, that had been longed for. And I think the point of youth is critically important, is when you talk about Kuchma and some of his successors, they were rooted in the Soviet experience. That's the kind of governance they understood. Today, you've got a whole generation of young people, well-educated, who had no experience under the Soviet period. And it is, I think, exactly right, this generational change and what they want to see in terms of their future aspirations, now set back by this war, but one in which they are very much trying to do everything they can to get to the other side of it, to continue this process. So you see a lot of this going on over time.
Actually, this linkage between women's activism and independence movements and nationalist movements, of course, is typical of colonial, post-colonial situations. I think not enough. I mean, in US historians, both of you have written eloquently on this, precisely the inability to see this as a post-colonial, post-imperial situation that neither Europeans nor the United States. So I want you to reflect on this condition, the post-colonial, post-imperial condition of Ukraine.
I'll get to the post-colonial, but first I'll do the war and Ukrainian past. And it's, as I said, it's always the danger of having historians who work on earlier periods.
That's why we have you here.
When you think of the 16th and 17th century, the century of the Tatar raids, the slave trades in it, the various revolts, the formation of those Cossack entities that become the dramatic parts of Ukrainian history, you also have to think of who was running the farm while those guys were going off to war. That is, it's not as if this is the first time that women have moved into roles. We have the famous Nastya Skoropadska, the hetman's wife, who we know was extremely important in both affairs of state, but we also had a society in which de facto women played a greater role. We also, at times, and then I'll move to our more current topic, we have two deeply ingrained ideas that somehow rights and democracy are associated with certain parts of Europe and their colonial offshoots, in which I count both Canada and the US. We forget that, in fact, the rights of British women were many less than those of Polish women in parts of the 17th and 18th century. That rights to both property, personhood came in certain parts of Eastern Europe before they came to the British Empire and its offshoots. So I think in some of those ways there are other traditions as well. I'll just say one more thing on this general topic, then to go to colonial and imperial models. I think Ukraine had some great advantages we didn't realize, in that it didn't have a clear model of where it should go, and it was greatly underestimated. And that sometimes turns out to be a benefit. And what do I mean by that? The Baltic countries had a fairly clear model when the Soviet Union broke up of where they were going, and I think generally it worked well for them. They partially went to the past, but they also had quickly the possibility of joining the European community and NATO, so they knew where they were going. Regrettably, Russia, where it seemed that there were possibilities for change in the 90s, could easily fall back on other models, which we see much more strongly now, both imperial and Soviet, and didn't have to prove itself to the outer world. It's why I think so much was missed in Russia, why so much of the 20 years. It's why you could have two Chechen wars and have the total destruction of the city of Grozny, and it didn't seem to register on the outer world that something is wrong with this state that can take part of its citizens and destroy them en masse and destroy a major city. Ukrainians had to prove themselves. They had to prove themselves that initially that they were worthy of even being seen as a nation. They had to go out to Europe and insist that they be called a Ukrainian and not a Russian. They also had to define themselves, and that definition process, I think, worked very interestingly. I had one example of this very early in the 90s. I was in Vienna and looking at the Reichstag, and which from Galicia and Bukovina, Ukrainian delegates of the Habsburgs had sat. And a group from Kharkiv arrived and were being taken on tour, and they said, oh, here is where our delegates sat. Well, of course, historically, this makes no sense. Their ancestors were part of the Russian Empire, and none of them had ever sat anywhere in Vienna before. But they were already making the pieces of a united Ukrainian history in which there had to be a lot of give and take. And eventually, I think, giving up on models that were firmly held. It sometimes was argued that Western Ukraine and Galicia had too strong a model of what it saw Ukrainian identity to be, but it had to give up part of this in order to do it. We'll talk later today about religion. Even the fact that a large part of Galicia is today Orthodox is how this society has changed. So I think all of these turned out, but above all because of the youth. And the final one is, I think we all have to put ourselves back to the Maidan and remember the shock first that the students were beaten by Yanukovych's forces, and remember them running to the monastery of St. Michael's and the monks ringing the bells. And that in Ukraine was a shocking idea. I mean, this was not killing hundreds of thousands of people in Grozny. This was students who fled up a hill. And then when they turned against the Maidan, and you had the Holy 100 who were shot, the 103 or 4, I don't remember the exact number, who were killed, resonated throughout Ukraine because there had been no major bloodshed in Ukraine until that point in those years. And it's almost impossible to think of that today, that at that point, what a shock the killing of 100 people was in a country of 40-some million people with what we've seen happen now. But I think it was a good sign of where Ukrainian society was going. And then on the colonial and post-colonial, yes, in two ways. We find it difficult because we think in terms of overseas colonies, to think of land empires who operate as colonies. We find it a little easier, I think, to think of the indigenous people of Siberia as being colonized, and we find it now, I think, given the Muslim-Christian divide and clear horror that Putin has that he has too many Muslims in his country and is sending them off to die in any way he can to try and cut down, and sees Ukraine as a biomass that he would have liked to gotten in whatever this bizarre imperial experiment he was in. The Ukrainian argument on colony has been, is Ukraine a colony, has been argued since at least the end of the 19th century, and clearly was argued very much in the 1920s in the Soviet Union. Was Ukraine being treated as a colony? What I think clearly, it's a tricky word, this decolonizing, and we're using it more and more. It's become the catchword of much of the academic discussion. I think is important for the discussion. Do we mean only an economic colony, or do we mean a cultural colony? But I think a perverse side is we finally came to look at the imperial and the unpleasant parts of the imperial nature of Russian culture and its colonial. We thought before, in studying Russian literature, there was a Caucasian school, and we understood that Russia was in that way a colonial entity. We now can begin to even look at Pushkin as the busts are taken away and remember he wrote to the slanderers of Russia against the attempts of Poles to form their independence. I checked Wikipedia, and that poem is left out under Pushkin's name. So it shows us that there is a great Russian literature of the 19th century, and Pushkin is a great writer. He also was a person with imperialist, colonialist views, and sometimes they are unpleasant, as they were in this. And I think that's being faced today. Now, how Ukraine will deal with this concept of to the degree it was colonized, and how much of it still accepts, like the Scots, who now want to get out of the United Kingdom, and in a certain way were so crucial for the formation of the British Empire. We must also study those Ukrainians who became part of an imperial structure. It's hard to ask people in Ukraine to be looking at this at the moment, and I think we're in the decolonizing and de-Russifying phase, but it'll be thought about again.
Yes, briefly, before we turn to the question and answer, both of you are directors, have directed centers of Ukrainian studies. Partly those centers were established precisely because the regular centers for Eurasian, Russian, East European studies, Ukraine simply did not have a voice in those. So I want you to just briefly to reflect on where we are on this and how it's affecting also even Ukrainian institutions. Certainly in Europe, for the first time, really, you have the need to have Ukrainian specialists that they didn't have. So I want just to reflect briefly, and then we turn to the.
Sure. Maybe I'll start, but I'll first maybe provide some examples of the importance of women in Ukrainian movement. Ukrainians have not just founding fathers in the 19th century who are poets, but founding mothers like Lesya Ukrainka, Marko Vovchok. So the representation of the women is quite dramatically higher than in the imperial or established cultures. And we talked about Mikhailo Hrushevsky and his history of Ukraine. When the competition was announced for writing the history of Ukraine, he lost to a woman, to Alexandra Yefemenko, who produced the first narrative of Ukrainian history in the 20th century. And at least in my explanation, that's the realization that marginalized group of women were able to find a central place in the project which was persecuted and marginalized and outside of the academia, outside of the imperial structure. So there is a strong impact of women on the formation and formulation of the Ukrainian national project. And in terms of the institutions, academic institutions, that's in many ways where the process of making Ukraine visible starts and begins here in North America, because the Ukraine is part of the majority of states today in today's world, which were not empires before, that didn't exist on the map before 1914, that came into existence out of the destruction of the empires, but then also reimagining the space, political, geopolitical, cultural, linguistic, historical, and otherwise. And the institutions, the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute and Frank Sisson was there certainly closer to the foundations, and the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies appeared on the academic map really in the 70s and in the 80s, when Ukraine as an independent state, as an independent country, didn't exist on the political map. So that really change and transformation in the academy here in North America really preceded the rise of independent Ukraine and appearance of that independent Ukraine on the map or map of the world as a whole. So that's how I look at that, and this is maybe in many ways not unique, in a sense that the concepts, the nations, the ideas emerge certainly in the minds of poets and thinkers and historians and writers, and at some point they turn into the institutions, either institutions created like Shevchenko Scientific Society or the institutions that appear in the academia. What was unique and is unique to a degree for the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, for the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, that they were established not within the diaspora structures. That was also a move into the mainstream, into the academic mainstream, into the cultural mainstream. And people who were doing that, they were really brave people, in particular intellectually brave as well. So we are today in a much better place to understand Ukraine. We still don't fully understand and underestimate and so on and so forth, but in a much better place than we would be without those institutions. And many other academic leaders and intellectual leaders from other countries of Eastern Europe really envy us that we have those institutions today.
This is part of your entire biography. Would you like to add
Well,
something?
not have my entire biography, thank God. But so first, I think since we're at Georgetown, what I want to say is it wasn't a one-way process. Lev Dobransky, a professor here at this university in the late 1940s and early 1950s, played a very prominent role in all kinds of congressional hearings. Ukraine was well represented. As we know, Raphael Lemkin, in his thinking about genocide, thought about Ukraine, including the Holodomor, as an essential aspect of it. The Kirsten Commission that comes in Washington to discuss these issues deals with Baltic and Ukrainian issues, and Dobransky was crucial in this. What it also shows us is that things can be forgotten very rapidly, and that generations in academia change within 15 or 20 years. And suddenly, Ukraine moved away from what would have been a major interest up until the late 1950s, where there was, I think, more realization, particularly of what had just happened. New trends came about in the field, and not least of which were the exchanges with the Soviet Union, which meant that the Soviet authorities decided who could come from the United States to work in archives. And American academia began to decide that if you didn't work in those archives, you were not likely to get a job. And suddenly people who had Ukrainian topics were somehow not accepted on those lists and did not go. So this had a great impact on changes of the field. Now, what was accomplished? The difference between the two countries is, there is no Canadian there are very few Canadians who have not met somebody of Ukrainian background. There are 1.4 million people of some Ukrainian descent in Canada, in a country of 36 million. So in practice, everyone has some cousin married to some Ukrainian. They may not have known where Ukraine is, but they knew that Ukrainians were there. So in Canada, it was a very different story, and largely Ukrainian studies existed because of the existence of a large community that was important in forming Canadian identity, and above all, multiculturalism. The American case is, above all, what we used to call the Harvard miracle, that 15,000 people raised the funds and went to Harvard, and Harvard accepted it. And that was very unclear as to why it would happen. Not to go into the story, the first chair is formed in 1968, and a great role is played in this by what interests of academics were. a very important historian, was Richard Pipes at Harvard at this time. His first book was on the formation of the Soviet Union. He himself, who had come from Poland, was very aware that there were ethnic and cultural complexities. There were a number of people, such as Adam Ulam, who came from the city of Lviv, who was at Harvard. So that particular environment was willing to look at the possibilities that the Ukrainian issue would be brought in. And then, of course, the professors who did it, Pritsak and Shevchenko, whom I'll mention. Shevchenko should be known to many Washingtonians from Dumbarton Oaks, where he was so prominent. But one of the world's leading Byzantinists and Turkologists showed you this was not a narrow field. Now, why didn't it take to the degree it did? Because sometime in the 1970s, academia and governments began to decide what the Soviet Union was going to be there forever. There really was a period in which you moved away from the old captive nations or rollbacks and whatever, and this Soviet reality seemed to be, and after all, it looked quite successful. Its successes in Africa, it was going to have a new multicultural national community that was going to divide, and then it all turned out differently. So Ukrainian studies became less important. I think the Ukrainian studies issue is above all when we try in academia to too quickly, let's say, find humorous or peripheral new trends within our field, whether they be from gender studies to many others. You have to look and see, are you really excluding it now? Now, of course, the places where the Ukrainian studies exist are all very proud of themselves, and academics are not as likely to say, we really thank those people in Scranton who raised the money to go to make the Harvard chair, because they may not have known the ins and outs of real academia, but they did something very important for it. And we have other such examples, of course, the Armenian chairs, which are a similar sort of development.
Okay, let's turn to the conversation. Everybody's invited, so please, your names and questions, comments, please. Because of the light, I can hardly see, please.
My name is Jorge Huete, originally from Nicaragua. I wonder if you care to say a few words about what's happening with universities right now in Ukraine. And the second thing is regarding Moldova. How do you see the interaction with what's happening now in Moldova? Slava Ukraini.
So, who would like to? Universities in Moldova.
Well, I can start and...
Yes, please.
It's extremely difficult situation. Again, at least 1/3 of the nation is not going to bed today where they used to go 1 year and a few months ago. And students are, of course, part of that story. City of Kharkiv, this is the second largest Ukrainian city and also the second largest in terms of the universities and schools of higher learning, has been under bombardment for the first few months of the war, and unfortunately the front line apparently has a tendency of moving closer as well, so it is under attack. And under attack and destroyed are university buildings. That was story in March, that was story in April, that continues to be, so a lot of people had to leave the city. The education not just with the universities, but also in the regular schools. The students are allowed to be in the building only if the school has a bomb shelter. So the Kyiv School of Economics recently had a fundraiser in New York specifically collecting money for shelters, to build shelters or maybe repair existing shelters in the schools. A lot of what is happening online. And it's a big issue on a number of levels, being addressed inadequately so far on a number of levels. One are the refugees, the academics, but also the students in Europe and partially in North America, and probably Frank Sisson could talk about experience in Toronto. On the other hand, it's what can you do to help both professors but also students in the country itself. And universities in general are more here in the North America are more open to the idea and have instruments and have programs of basically, okay, given a couple of fellowships here and there, scholars at risk, accepting them. But this is a small, tiny portion of 1% of basically a story that where 35% of the population, including the university population, is displaced. So a huge issue that has to be addressed has not been addressed adequately so far. In terms of Moldova, when I think about Moldova, the worst case scenario that comes to my mind is, of course, Belarus. So it's basically a possibility of opening another front line or creating another place from which the Russian drones or Russian attacks can take place, in particular the Transnistria region. So it is extremely important story for what will happen in Ukraine and for the outcome of the war. That's one thought. Another thought is that Ukrainians very often are referred to, but also they imagine themselves and their fight and their struggle as fight and struggle not just for them, but for Europe as a whole, for European values and so on and so forth. Nowhere this is more true than in case of Moldova. The country is already being divided. There is basically a Russia-controlled enclave there. So this is a case that the closest case, the easiest case to make that on the outcome of the war and conflict in Ukraine depends not just the fate of Ukraine, but also other countries and fate of Europe as well. And Moldova is one of those countries whose future really depends on what will happen on the front lines in Donbass today.
I just add that on Moldova, I was at the Munich Security Conference a couple weeks ago, and it was so striking how the concern about Moldova was caught up in many ways in the overall dominance of the Ukraine issue, which literally overtook the MSC. But the fact that these protests, these are growing protests, they're Russia-inspired, great concern that the leadership of Moldova is going to be overthrown in the process, and that this is just a continuation, as you just heard, of what's been happening in Ukraine. Moldova's next. So you've got these great concerns, rightly so, because the situation is getting more aggravated by the day.
Maybe just two comments. There is an exhibit, 36 diplomas that will never be given. It just opened in Toronto. It's opening internationally in at 45 or 50 countries. I don't know where the American exhibit is. It is the bios and the pictures and the lives of those 36 students who have been killed by the war, have been murdered. It was run by the students we have from the Mohyla Academy and Kiev Economic Institute in Toronto, brave young people who are in Toronto at the moment. Fortunately, we have a large program which is in combination with the Mohyla Academy, intending that these students will return. That is, it's not to draw them away from Ukraine, but to keep them involved. But I just thought, as looking at them as we talk with them later, they have to look at these photos, all of them. So when we think of the university students at this point, it is, of course, a time for the future, when we'll be discussing later in this conference, for the replanning of Ukrainian higher education, which has many things that need to be changed, and I think those will be addressed by some others. And then the only other thing I would mention about Moldova, after all, since a large part of the population of Moldova really also has a Romanian passport because of the specific cultural, national parts of this, this is already a European problem. Europe has taken in so many of the Ukrainian refugees temporarily. The Moldovan issue would be much clearer. I mean, it's a danger that it's not a large country, and of course, they could all move across the border from Romania and then into the Latin-based speaking, Romance-speaking countries where their language fits quite well. But the other side is, if anyone needed the proof that although there is a part of the crazed Putin plan which is aimed that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, Ukrainians don't exist, and if they insist they exist, we will destroy them. So which is the genocidal, I think, clear, the genocide issue, which is, I think, going to be discussed much by genocide scholars, the type of genocide this is, and we're going to have to deal with it. If you ever wanted to ever questioned, is it only Ukraine, the fact that it's already pushing into Moldova really does show that it is not, that this disease that has taken over the Putin, the Russian government, the Russian elite, really is something that will go beyond, would go beyond Ukraine if it cannot be stopped.
And I think politically you see that worry, tremendous worry by the fact that Finland wants to accede to NATO, which, given its shared border with Russia, is something I don't think was anticipated. Similarly with Sweden, the Baltic states, among the strongest advocates for upping the ability for Ukraine to win this war, is again, I think, representative of the fact that they're so worried about what happens next in their region, which has the geographical proximity, and they've lived through it before. So this is all connected in many ways.
The issue of the reconstruction of educational institutions is going to be a core issue that we'll be covering in the third session today. In the second session, we will have Archbishop Boris Guziak, the founder of Ukrainian Catholic University, who probably will also comment about the role of students in both in the Orange Revolution and in Maidan at the beginning of the processes. So please, other questions, comments? Please, here and then. Okay, yes, please. Yes, please. And then the lady behind.
Okay, thank you. My name is Darian Diachak. I used to work in Ukraine for a few years in the field of energy. The question is that so many experts thought that Ukraine would not last more than a few weeks. And I think that has to do with the current understanding at the time of what Ukrainian was ethnically and politically. And there are even prominent historians at the time who believed the same thing. There was even Orest Subtelny, the diaspora historian, who also said that that Ukraine has been so successfully Sovietized that the Ukrainian identity is pretty much gone. And I think there have been other historians who have said the same. So that probably has to do with the reason that so many people said Ukraine will not last more than a few weeks. Do you know of any historians who understood Ukraine better and who didn't share that notion that Ukraine will not last more than a few weeks, but would put up this incredible resistance?
Well, I think you have two prominent historians here, you could say, and I think they sort of cover some of these issues. Would you like to add something? And obviously we know historians in Ukraine themselves, colleagues and...
Yeah, I would quibble about Orest Subtelny's views. I mean, of course, he had passed away before all these recent events. He did point out, as anyone had to who knew the history of 20th century Ukraine, the various attacks on Ukrainian culture, the Ukrainian dissidents, and all of these things were true. On the other hand, his history of Ukraine, which came out in 1988, I believe, in English, was translated almost immediately into Ukrainian. And if you meet anyone of a certain age in Ukraine and say, and how did you change your views from the Soviet views about Ukraine? He'll say, I had Subtelny's book. So he played a tremendous role through that book in rekindling a kind of Ukrainian identity there. Now Ukrainian writing on history has become much more varied. There are many other books, but that book played a tremendous role, and above all, its translation.
Yeah, you can check my interview in New Yorker, published a few days before the invasion. They were basically not the minority, but a significant number of people, historians and non-historians, who were saying that Ukrainians would resist. So it was just one of many. But there was making predictions of how successful, that's a different thing. But one of the historians whom I certainly recommend in terms of the understanding Ukraine, Ukraine's past and Ukraine's today is Timothy Snyder. So I certainly recommend looking at his writings, and online YouTube lectures and interviews and opinion pieces.
And of course, the arms that the US gave Ukraine first were based on the notion that, yes, the government will fall, but Ukraine will resist this while they need javelins. And so the original arms were meant for the resistance after Ukraine falls. Please, there was a lady there that before and then you.
Hi, I'm Diana. I'm a Georgetown student. I'm getting my doctoral degree here. Regarding the previous question about a Ukrainian historian who could give a different perspective on the Ukrainian war, I would recommend to read Mykola Ryabchuk, even though he is not a historian per se, but he is a prominent journalist and a political essayist about the identity of Ukrainians and so on. But my question is related to colonization of Ukraine. Before you mentioned that there is some questions about was it successful or not, the colonizing of Ukraine, but I would say Russia was trying for centuries to colonize Ukraine in so many different ways, and there are so many different examples from the very beginning with this notion of trying to say that Ukrainians are the other, they're like us, but not quite, they're a little lower, so that's why there is this nickname, a little Russians. But the question is about, should Ukraine in the future embrace post-colonialism or post-colonialism as a one word, in the meaning that the first one would mean embracing nationality, which is good in some way, but it also can turn to negative nationalism, which in some ways we can see even today when Ukrainians are deciding not to include any Russian literature in school program. I mean, going too far, like closing museums of Russian writers. So that is post-colonialism. And then maybe the better way for Ukrainians would be to get this post-colonialism as one word, which would mean embracing multicultural, embracing pluralism, also allowing different ethnicities live in Ukraine, speak whatever language they want to speak. So what do you think, which will be the better way for Ukraine to move forward?
Yes.
Looks like
Well, bring
we
the Crimean Tatars,
are going in the same order. Yeah. One thing that is very clear that the way how the monuments or literary museums appeared in Ukraine was not part of some sort of democratic process or something that was created in independent Ukraine. This is a legacy. In case of many monuments, imperial legacy. In case of many museums, certainly Soviet legacy. And they are the markers of the imperial past and imperial domination. The markers that are being actively used also in the temporarily occupied parts of Ukraine, like Kherson, we know that the same Pushkin, the parts of the Russian history, and so on and so forth. So this de-imperialization, decolonization of the Ukrainian public space is long overdue. It started with the so-called Leninopad, the demolition of the monuments to Lenin, and now it continues as a process of decolonization. What you see on the one hand is that Ukrainians survived in 2014, and Ukraine survives today as a multi-ethnic and multicultural society. It would fall apart otherwise in 2014. It would not survive the year 2022. Putin came to Ukraine with the idea that if you speak Russian, you are Russian, your loyalty has to be to Russia. And Ukraine responded by fighting the war in at least two languages, not allowing itself to be divided along religious lines, ethnic lines, and so on and so forth. This is the only country in the world outside of Israel led by the president of Jewish origin, of Jewish background. So that's what is happening. That's why one of the reasons why Ukraine didn't fall over the period of few days or few weeks. Now, what you see also at the same time, and that's where I started, the process of decolonization and process of increased importance of Ukrainian language and Ukrainian culture, symbolically and otherwise. And here, from my perspective, the key thing is, as long as these processes are happening as part of the civic dialogue, these are the processes that bring Ukraine closer to the level of homogeneity where it would become stronger. To a degree that it can happen as the result of the push by the state, by the government, or by one aggressive group, that is not only bad for Ukraine in the future, it's bad for Ukraine today for its ability to sustain the aggression, to sustain the pressure. So the story is complex, it's dynamic, it changes. This last year changed a lot in Ukrainian self-perception, self-understanding. In the conditions of the war, when you are under missile attacks and other things, you have impulses to act today and now. That's very natural. But one thing to keep in mind is that in this world today, where the populism, nationalism, xenophobia are really becoming extremely important political factors, not just in Europe, in the United States as well. Ukraine is the country in which no nationalist party is being represented in the parliament. Not because of some sort of legislation, because those nationalist parties, the largest one is Svoboda, never crossed the 5% barrier to get into the parliament. And that's the context for the discussion of Ukrainian nationalism and issues related to that.
Unfortunately, we could continue much longer, but we already passed our time. I only want to point to this issue that Crimea is the next key place to decolonize, in the sense that the Russian insistent that Crimea is Russian. Of course, it's a Russian colony. Tell the Crimean Tatars, the natives of Crimea, and the context within Ukraine.
I would only add to that, if you get a chance, Rory Finnan, who is at the University of Cambridge, has just put out a book on Crimea and Crimean literature and culture that does a wonderful discussion of these issues of colonialism, Orientalism, as well as the connections between Ukrainian writers and literary figures and those in Crimea. And I do agree that, you know, in these discussions, I have been amazed at the relative lack of attention throughout these periods since the seizure of Crimea, lack of interest with the Crimean Tatars at a time when many of our societies, and Canada is I think prominent among them, are trying to deal with indigenous issues, and yet the Crimean Tatars seem to have fallen off in the discussion. They have to be brought back in.
Despite how seriously persecuted they are. I would just say that diversity is a strength. It's very hard to maintain, but to the extent Ukraine can continue to be the blossoming place that it's been in terms of other nationalities and language, and is its strength. But as we're seeing in the United States, this is a fight that's going on here in very serious ways. So it's an important question to grapple with.
Well, thank you to all three panelists. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you.